Abandoned furnaces in villages. This is part 4 of the chapter Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners. Dear students, in the previous video we discussed about the wood still, iron smelters and other topics in the previous videos of this chapter. So today we'll start with the topic abandoned furnaces in villages. There were furnaces in the villages for iron smelting, right? So production of wood still required a highly specialized technique of refining iron. But iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of 19th century. What was the process there for iron smelting and who were involved in this process? So let's discuss about this topic. We are talking about Bihar and Central India. In particular, every district had smelters that used local deposits of ore. Iron ore was found in these areas in Bihar and Central India, in parts of Central India. So due to the availability of iron ore, this was used for iron smelting, right, which was widely used for manufacture of implements and tools for daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun-dried bricks, very simple bricks, sun-dried, and clay was used for making furnaces for iron smelting. The smelting was done by men while women worked the bellows, pumping air. Bellows were the devices or equipments which were used for pumping air in the furnaces, so that kept the charcoal burning. So charcoal also was used on extensive part for iron smelting. You can see in this picture, this one, women and men both were engaged in this kind of work in the forested region. This is a picture of a village in central India where the Agarias were the community who were involved in iron smelting. So Agarias were the community of iron smelters, lived in the villages in central India. By late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. Means there was a declination in iron smelting. By the late 19th century, it means till 1890 or 1900. So during this period, iron smelting, craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? Why this happened? Earlier, the villagers were engaged in iron smelting and furnaces were used for smelting iron ore, for making different kinds of equipment, simple tools for daily uses. But now it was stopped. Why? One reason was the new forest laws, about which we have discussed in chapter 4, that due to passing new forest laws, forests were divided into 3 categories. According to the forest laws of 1878, forests were divided into 3 categories. These categories were reserved forest, permanent forest, and we can say that protected forest, and after that unclassed forest or village forest. So the people were not allowed to enter in the forest, reserved forest, because these were reserved completely. How could the iron smelters find wood for charcoal if they were not allowed to enter in the forest? Where could they get iron ore? Defying forest laws, they often entered the forest secretly and collected wood, but it was very risky and very dangerous, because if they were caught, they were arrested and after that they were punished. So they could not sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft due to this reason and looked for other means of livelihood, or we can say that in search of other work. They were looking for other work. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. So this reduced their income, because they had to pay the taxes, high taxes. They also had to spend some amount of money for running the furnaces. So in this way, it was not work for the profit for iron smelters, and by doing this work or iron smelting, they could not get the profit. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. You have to remember this digit, particular data. Late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Iron smiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. So now, which iron was used? That was imported from Britain, not smelted by the iron smelters in India. So this inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by our local smelters, right? Because local smelters used to produce the local iron by smelting. Iron smelters used to do this work, but now the demand for their work, their iron smelted by them was reduced. Demand was reduced because of the availability of iron manufactured in Britain. So by the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition. They had to face new competition: slag heaps, the waste left when smelting metal. Iron and steel factories come up in India. This is very interesting story, that how iron and steel industries set up in India. The first was Tisco. In 1904, hot month of April, you know that April is very hot. April and May, June, July, these are very hot months in India. Charles Weld, American geologist, he was an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, eldest son of J.N. Tata, Jamshedji Nusrawanji Tata. They were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They wanted to find the deposits of iron ore. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for sources of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamshedji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India. So definitely he wanted to set up a big industry in India, iron industry. But this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. The problem was this, that they had no source of fine quality of iron ore. So one day they saw, during their traveling in the forest, they came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. They were surprised to know that this is the iron ore carried by them. So these people were the Agarias. As we have discussed before a short while, that Agarias community of iron smelters. So when I asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agarias pointed to a hill in the distance. They reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forests. On exploring the hill, the geologist declared that they had at last found what they had been looking for. It means finally they got what they were finding, what they were looking for. They got the place, the source of fine quality of iron ore at last. It was called Rajhara Hills, had one of the finest iron ores in the world. But there was a problem. Now, what was the problem? They got the source. They got the source of iron ore, fine quality of iron ore. But problem was this, that this region was completely dry and water was very necessary for running the factory. Without water, you cannot run the factory. But it was the dry region. So it was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. However, the Agarias helped in the discovery of source of iron ore that would later supply the Bhilai steel plant. Bhilai steel plant, it is situated in Chhattisgarh, you know. So they supplied to this industry. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha. You have to remember the river Subarnarekha, to set up the factory and an industrial township, Jamshedpur. So Jamshedpur is situated on the banks of the river Subarnarekha. Here there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, it is known as TISCO, was established and started the production in 1912. So finally, Tisco was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of the railways in India had provided a huge market for rails that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India, right? Because of setting up of Tisco and like these industries, fine quality of iron ore was used in these industries and good quality of products were produced of iron. By the time Tisco was set up, the situation was changing. 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. As we already have discussed that during the First World War, 1914 to 1918, these were the years when Indian industries grew. Indian industries got profit, and because British industries were involved and engaged in fulfilling the demands for the war. So Indian industries got the opportunity to be improved their conditions and to be profited. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by Tisco. Over time, Tisco became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. In the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, industrial expansion occurred only when British imports into India declined and the market for Indian Indian industrial goods increased. So this happened during the First World War and after. So you have to remember this point that during and after First World War, Indian industries grew very fastly as the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger. The demand for government protection became louder. Struggling to retain its control over India, the British government had to concede many of these demands in the last decades of colonial rule. So this was the process of the development of industries in India, especially metal industries. And earlier we have studied about the textile industry. So metallic in among the metallic industry, Jamshedpur, Tisco is very important, and in cotton and textile industries, 1854 in Bombay it was set up first cotton mill. It is very important. Early years of industrialization in Japan. Now we'll study about this extract about Japan. The history of industrialization of Japan in the late 19th century presents a contrast to that of India. The colonial state in India, keen to expand the market for British goods, was unwilling to support Indian industrialists. In Japan, the state encouraged the growth of industries. So particularly, we have come to know that in Japan, the government encouraged the process of growing up the industries or the setting up of industries. This process, Meiji government or Meiji regime, which assumed power in Japan in 1868. You have to remember. This government believed that Japan needed to industrialize in order to resist Western domination. So if we have to avoid the Western domination, we have to be very developed in industrial manners. So it initiated a series of measures to help industrialization. So in this way, in Japan, industrialization process became very faster, and postal services, telegraph, railways, steam powered shipping were developed. So because these are very important in the development of industries, the most advanced technology from the West was imported and adapted to the needs of Japan. Foreign experts were brought to train Japanese professionals. Industrialists were provided with generous loans for investment by banks set up by the government, and large industries were first started by the government and then sold off at cheap rates to business families. So this was the process of development of industries in Japan. In India, colonial domination created barriers to industrialization. In Japan, the fear of foreign conquest spurred industrialization. So in both of the countries, the situations were different. In Japan, it was the fear among the Japanese that we have to avoid the domination of the Western people or Western industries. So we have to be developed in the industrialization. But in India, it was a separate matter. So this was the difference in the process of development of industries. But this also meant that the Japanese industrial development from beginning was linked to military needs. So it was only producing the military needs for purposes. These kinds of commodities were produced in Japanese industries. So dear students, finally we have completed this chapter. I hope that you understood. Keep revising and learn the topic. Read from the textbook. Thank you. Have a nice day.